Morning of July 6, 2013, an Asiana Airlines Boeing 777 aircraft was nearing San Francisco International Airport after a long flight. The flight number was Asiana Airlines Flight 214. The Boeing 777 is well known for its safety and reliability. Asiana Airlines also had a good safety record up until this point. The atmosphere in the cabin was calm. Passengers were enjoying the final moments of the trip. Some were looking out the windows, admiring the clear sky and beautiful scenery. There were 4 pilots on this flight. The captain, 46-year-old Lee Kang-kook, was undergoing training on the Boeing 777. He had 9,700 hours of total flight experience, but only 43 hours on the Boeing 777. He was the flying pilot for this flight. The co-pilot, 49-year-old Lee Jong-min, was acting as his instructor and monitoring pilot. He had more than 12,000 flight hours and was responsible for supervising the approach and landing. There was also a relief captain and a relief co-pilot on board. This kind of rotation system is standard on long-haul flights to make sure the pilots are well rested, especially for critical phases like approach and landing. After about 10 hours of flying, the plane was cleared for a straight-in visual approach to runway 28L at San Francisco International Airport. The weather conditions that day were good for a visual landing, light winds and 10 miles visibility. Runway 28L is 11,381 feet long and 200 feet wide, suitable for large aircraft like the Boeing 777. The airport had an Instrument Landing System, ILS, which is a precise radio navigation aid used in poor weather or low visibility to guide the aircraft to land. But on the day of the accident, the glide slope signal for runway 28L was turned off, which made the approach more complicated. With no automatic guidance to manage the descent angle, the crew had to manually control the plane's descent to stay on the correct glide path. Even though the glide slope was off, the localizer was still active, providing left-right lateral guidance for the approach. The captain flying the aircraft had limited experience with the Boeing 777 and had never landed it manually without ILS. This was also his first time doing a visual approach to San Francisco International Airport. Although the captain felt unsure and uneasy, he kept silent, possibly due to cultural reasons. In cultures that value respect for authority, he may have hesitated to express doubt in front of his more experienced instructor. At 11:12 a.m. local time, about 15 minutes before landing, the relief captain returned to the cockpit, sitting behind the captain and co-pilot. By then, the crew had completed their descent checklist. As the plane continued flying toward the airport, they were cleared to descend to a lower altitude and guided onto the straight-in path to runway 28L. 9 minutes later, air traffic control asked if the crew could see the airport. The co-pilot confirmed they could, so the controller cleared them for a visual approach. At that time, the plane was descending through 6,300 feet, at a speed of around 211 knots. The flaps and landing gear were not yet extended. The autopilot and flight director were in FLCH SPD mode, Flight Level Change Speed Mode, which adjusts the pitch of the plane to maintain a selected descent airspeed. Pulling the nose up slows the plane down. Pushing the nose down speeds it up. The auto throttle was in hold mode, which means it no longer adjusted engine thrust automatically. Unless the pilots made manual changes, the engines would keep running at the current setting. At 11:23 a.m., as the plane descended to 4,800 feet, it captured the localizer signal. The pilot set flaps to 1, and the co-pilot confirmed and checked speed. The aircraft was about 14 miles from the runway. Air traffic control told them to reduce speed to 180 knots and maintain that speed until they were 5 miles from the runway. The pilots responded by adjusting speed and setting flaps to 5. Even though these actions were correct, they kept the autopilot in FLCH SPD mode, which made it harder to manage the descent. In this mode, The autopilot controls descent by adjusting the plane's nose angle to keep the chosen speed. So when the pilot slowed the plane, the autopilot raised the nose to help reduce speed, but that also slowed the descent. If the crew had used speed brakes at this point, the situation might have improved, but they did not. This decision caused the plane to drop below the proper glide path. Now things started to go wrong. The pilots didn't immediately notice that the aircraft had fallen below the correct 3-degree descent angle. At the same time, the descent rate dropped to 300 feet per minute, which was too slow to stay on the glide path. At this point, the aircraft was 11.5 nautical miles from the runway, descending through 4,300 feet. The captain changed the autopilot mode from FLCH SPD to vertical speed, VS mode, setting the descent rate to -1,000 feet per minute. In FLCH SPD mode, the autopilot adjusted the descent to maintain the chosen speed. In VS mode, the pilots manually chose the descent rate. While this gave them more control over descent, it required closer attention to speed to avoid mismanaging it. Meanwhile, the auto throttle switched from hold mode to SPD mode. In hold mode, it didn't control engine thrust, but in SPD mode, it would try to adjust thrust to match the selected speed. Even though the descent rate increased to -1,000 feet per minute, it still wasn't enough to get the plane back on the correct glide path. The plane continued to drift low. The relief captain reminded the crew that air traffic control had told them to keep their speed at 180 knots until 5 miles from the runway. The monitoring co-pilot confirmed this reminder, but the pilots still hadn't reduced the speed to 180 knots. At this point, the plane was flying too fast, which made it harder for the pilots to manage both altitude and speed effectively. At 11:24 a.m., when the aircraft was about 8.5 nautical miles from the runway, the flying captain ordered the landing gear to be lowered. Lowering the landing gear increases drag, which helps slow the plane down. However, despite the increased drag, the descent rate was still not enough to get the plane back on to the correct glide path. The captain could have also ordered the flaps to be set to 20, which would have increased drag even more, but he didn't. As a result, the plane was still flying about 900 feet too high above the ideal descent path. The crew's workload started to increase. They began to struggle with managing both airspeed and altitude. The monitoring co-pilot noticed that the aircraft was too high on the approach. The captain agreed, but didn't take immediate action. A few seconds later, the captain asked for confirmation, but the co-pilot gave a vague response. Then, the captain set the vertical speed to -1,500 feet per minute to try to bring the aircraft back to the proper glide path. For the next 21 seconds, no one in the cockpit spoke. The aircraft descended at 1,500 feet per minute down to 2,600 feet. Even after this adjustment, the plane was still too high. The descent rate was then reduced back to -1,000 feet per minute, which was not enough, because the aircraft was still well above the desired glide path. To correct the approach, the plane needed a faster descent. The crew failed to maintain a high enough descent rate, showing a lack of awareness of the aircraft's vertical position relative to the glide path. At 11:25, air traffic control instructed the crew to contact the San Francisco control tower. The monitoring co-pilot acknowledged the instruction. Shortly after, the captain confirmed the go-around altitude was set to 3,000 feet, which would be used if a go-around became necessary. A moment later, the plane passed over the last waypoint, descending through 2,250 feet over Dumba, a navigation fix located about 5.4 nautical miles from the runway. At that point, the minimum crossing height should have been 1,800 feet, but the plane was still about 450 feet too high, indicating it was not well positioned for a stable approach. Being too high at that point made it much harder to stabilize the landing before reaching 500 feet above ground, a critical height by which the aircraft must be properly aligned and stable to ensure a safe landing. The flaps were set to 20, and the aircraft was descending through 1,900 feet. Soon after, the selected target speed was reduced to 152 knots. The captain requested further flap extension. However, the aircraft's actual speed was still above 170 knots, which is the maximum allowed speed for setting flaps to 30, so they could not extend the flaps further at that moment. Flaps 30 would have helped reduce speed more effectively, but the aircraft remained too fast and too high, while the runway was getting closer very quickly. The captain, trying to manage the descent, realized he needed to lose altitude more quickly, so he changed the autopilot mode from vertical speed back to FLCHSPD, flight level change speed. However, he did not announce this change as required by Boeing 77 procedures. The monitoring co-pilot was focused on airspeed and did not notice this autopilot change. When the airspeed finally dropped below 170 knots, the co-pilot immediately set flaps to 30. When FLCHSPD mode is active, the autopilot tries to slow the plane to the selected speed by raising the nose of the aircraft. The target speed was 152 knots, but the actual speed was still around 172 knots. As the autopilot raised the nose to slow the aircraft, at the same time, the plane was still set to climb to the go-around altitude of 3,000 feet, which was about 1,550 feet above their current altitude. Because of that, the autothrottle advanced the thrust levers to start a climb. This created a conflict. One system was trying to slow down, raising the nose, while another was trying to increase thrust to climb. The captain noticed something was wrong. He double-clicked the yoke switch to disconnect the autopilot in order to prevent warning sounds from going off. Now in manual control, he pulled the thrust levers to idle and pushed the yoke forward to stop the climb. However, by pulling the thrust levers manually to idle, he accidentally switched the autothrottle into hold mode. This meant the autothrottle no longer adjusted thrust automatically to maintain the selected speed. Since the engines were now at idle, the plane's speed began to drop rapidly. Unfortunately, the crew did not realize the autothrottle had been disconnected. As a result, the aircraft's airspeed dropped out of control. At 11:26 a.m., when the aircraft was about 2.9 nautical miles from the runway, the captain set the selected target speed to 137 knots, while the actual airspeed was still around 165 knots. The descent rate was approximately 1,000 feet per minute. At this distance, the crew should have been able to see the PAPI lights, Precision Approach Path Indicator. At that moment, the PAPI showed 4 white lights, indicating the aircraft was well above the correct glide path. There was an unwritten habit within Asiana Airlines. During a visual approach, the flying pilot's flight director, FD, would be turned off, while the monitoring pilot's FD remained on. However, proper procedure required that both flight directors be turned off before reactivating just one. In this case, only the captain's FD was turned off. Had both FDs been turned off, the autothrottle would have returned to SPD mode, restoring automatic speed control. This missed step may have contributed to the rapid airspeed loss that followed. As the aircraft descended through 1,000 feet, the airspeed was 151 knots, and the PAPI still showed 4 white lights. The plane was still too high. However, the speed was already very low, and the descent rate had now become much higher than needed. Throughout the descent, the aircraft had been too high, but now it was dropping rapidly, making the approach even more unstable. The crew's attention seemed divided. The captain kept switching focus between staying on the glide path and controlling the airspeed. Because the aircraft had not stabilized by the critical decision height of 500 feet, the pilots should have initiated a go-around. But they didn't notice that key flight parameters had already fallen outside the limits for a safe, stable approach. Or perhaps they thought the deviations were small and could be corrected in time. The plane's airspeed started to drop below the reference speed of 132 knots, while the PAPI lights showed the aircraft was now below the glide path. 1 white light and 3 red. Both the co-pilot and the relief observer noticed the low airspeed, but no immediate corrective action was taken. The captain raised the pitch angle to about 4 degrees, but it wasn't enough to stop the descent or restore proper airspeed. At 200 feet, the airspeed had dropped to 122 knots, and the PAPI lights showed 4 red lights, a clear warning the plane was far below the glide path. The aircraft was now losing altitude rapidly, and the airspeed continued to drop to 114 knots. The co-pilot called out, "Too low." By now, both the glide path and airspeed were severely out of control. The captain couldn't clearly see the PAPI lights anymore. Despite all these warnings and visual cues, the crew still did not initiate a go-around. This was a crucial decision that could have allowed them to abort the landing and try again safely. But now it was too late. The aircraft speed dropped to 103 knots. The stick shaker, a warning of an impending stall, started vibrating the control column. The co-pilot advanced the thrust levers to try and apply go-around power. The engines began to respond, but by that time, the aircraft was only 39 feet above the ground. It was too late to prevent impact. The captain pulled the yoke back, trying to make the aircraft climb. But the plane was too low, and disaster was unavoidable. At 11:27 a.m., Asiana Airlines Flight 214's tail struck the seawall at the edge of the runway. The impact tore off the tail section of the plane. Several passengers were ejected from the aircraft. The aircraft then spun, slid down the runway, and finally came to a stop on the grass beside the runway. The emergency slides were deployed, and passengers were quickly evacuated. The main cause of the crash was the crew's mismanagement of the aircraft's speed and altitude during the final approach. The flight crew failed to monitor key flight parameters, including airspeed and vertical profile, resulting in an unstable approach. Despite multiple warnings and visual cues, the pilots did not initiate a go-around, and the aircraft hit the seawall just before the runway, leading to the crash.
Of the 307 people on board, 304 survived. The investigation highlighted the crew's lack of experience flying visual approaches without ILS, the captain's limited experience with the Boeing 777, and poor communication among the crew. After the crash, several safety recommendations were made, including better training for manual flying skills, approaches without ILS assistance. This accident is a powerful reminder of the importance of situational awareness, clear communication, and proper use of automation in flight operations.